Welcome back. Challenges faced by people living with disabilities were in the spotlight as the world observed International Day of Persons with Disabilities and National Disability Rights Awareness Day yesterday. The observance of these days is aimed at promoting an understanding of disability issues. It also is geared towards offering support for the dignity, rights and well-being of persons with disabilities. The commemorative days, which both occur on 3 December, follow Disability Rights Awareness Month, which wrapped up in November. To help us understand challenges faced by this community, we're joined now by Phuthi Mabelebele, who is Chief Director, Advocacy and Mainstreaming of the Department of Women, Youth and People with Disabilities. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Could I ask you to please explain not only the challenges by people living with disabilities, but when we talk about mainstreaming in your department, how exactly are you doing it and what are the main objectives?
Thank you very much, and good evening to yourselves and the viewers. Yes, the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities is located and strategically placed in the Office of the Presidency, specifically to coordinate and to advocate and to mainstream the rights of persons with disabilities through regulation of the policy and the legislative environment. So when we talk mainstreaming, going straight to the question that you've asked, is that we're expecting that it becomes the business of everyone in all departments, because persons with disabilities are part of citizenry. So we expect all duty bearers, both in the public sector and the private sector, to mainstream for disability inclusion in all their programs and projects in their respective departments and services that they are rendering to the broader citizenry, which includes persons with disabilities.
As I asked, what are your objectives, particularly because they're basic things that able-bodied people take for granted, which can be extremely difficult without proper support for people living with disabilities?
One of the critical things that we have to get right is removing the stigmatization, the attitudes that hinder access for persons with disabilities, which have become a very critical barrier in persons with disabilities accessing opportunities and also accessing services across wherever they need to get services. So one of the critical aspects is dealing with the issues of attitudes, which fuel discriminatory practices, because persons with disabilities are discriminated against on the basis of their disability. Therefore, as a department, what we do, we monitor and evaluate programs of government. We ensure compliance with legislative instruments that require duty bearers. Like I said, it's not only government, but also both in government and in the private sector, to ensure that they comply with all the aspects of disability inclusion in all our programs, as we plan, as we budget, etc. So we do monitor, we do evaluate, we produce reports that we process about the status of persons with disabilities and how persons with disabilities remain discriminated against in terms of accessing services. So it's our role to advocate, to create more awareness around issues around the various disabilities that are there. But also of importance is to also empower persons with disabilities through their respective organizations of persons with disabilities and organizations that are for persons with disabilities, to strengthen their their self-representation in all aspects of society. We therefore create awareness, like for instance with the Disability Rights Awareness Month and the 365 Days campaign on different disabilities, specifically because people discriminate against persons with disabilities because they do not know about the different disabilities that are there. So we partner and collaborate with the different civil society organizations in doing this particular advocacy work.
What I find difficult, though, is that there are public spaces. We're talking about national key points where public access for people with disabilities is actually so archaic. It's almost it's heartbreaking, really. People who go to public buildings and there are no ramps, even lifts that don't work, if you're talking about security. So from a government point of view, it's these structural things that I think we should still not be talking about. How do you ring fence your allocation? What do you choose? What to fund, when to fund. That's why I was asking, what are your core objectives? So having a disability is a consequence of an impairment that may be physical, cognitive, mental, sensory, emotional, developmental, combination of these things. And some of them are unexpected for one to experience. Reduced mobility, for instance. So should some of these aids not be in place? Braille, we know that that is still a major issue.
Yes. I must say that you specifically mentioned issues around access. Access, specifically going to your question with regard to the built environment. As a department, we're working with the departments that deliver services with regard to the built environment, which may be your human settlements in terms of housing, your public works, for instance, in terms of public infrastructure, in terms of buildings as our landlord. Those are the matters that they have to implement and ensure disability inclusion thereof. So what we do as a Department of Women, we publish regulations, we publish frameworks, and guide duty bearers in terms of the areas that they need to pay attention to. As an example, we have got what we call the Universal Design and Access Framework, which talks to how to make the built environment accessible to persons with disabilities. And therefore, all the duty bearers that are in the built environment have got norms and standards that they've developed in order to ensure that their various infrastructure are actually accessible for various disabilities and for various persons with disabilities. What I must say and indicate is that we have a challenge with existing infrastructure, especially old infrastructure, which still needs to be modified for access for persons with disabilities. But we are seeing various government departments through their landlord improving their facilities and modifying them, putting up ramps, putting up braille features in their lifts, ensuring that there's adequate basic minimum access that will enable persons with disabilities to be able to access services. That is old infrastructure. But with new infrastructure, with the published norms and standards that are there, we are beginning to see new infrastructure rollout that are making facilities accessible to persons with disabilities. I always give an example of the newly built infrastructure in terms of hotels, in terms of malls, and so forth, and even government buildings that are newly built, that most of them are built with universal access features in them to ensure that persons with disabilities are able to access those buildings. The challenge still lies with the infrastructure that is old. For us to ensure that it's modified and it's made accessible. So the department has got what we call a job access that departments are expected to report on annually to track progress in terms of how they are ensuring that persons with disabilities access their infrastructure. Just as an example, because the job access is too broad, but the built infrastructure is one of the aspects we are attending to in the job access framework.